Hans Ulrich, you have been asked by Seshima to do all these interviews with the architects and artists of the exhibition, of course, because you are a famous and exquisite interviewer, but I think also because of your affinity to architecture. Could you tell us something about that without now talking too much about specific personalities, but in general, what does architecture mean to you?
Yeah, I suppose as a curator, it really started all with exhibition design, and I sort of started, when I started to work with Kaspar Koenig and working on the book Öffentlicher Blick, and then we did a painting show together. I mean, he always mentioned one needs an architect for an exhibition, and he obviously mentioned von Hierhaus and Westkunst, where he had, I think for von Hierhaus it was Czech, and for Westkunst it should have been Ludwig Leo who didn't do it, and then Ungers did it. So we also had for Vienna, for our Broken Mirror show, Artec, but it was also really that time at the Städelschule, where Kaspar was rector at the time, that I started to meet architects. It was the first time I kind of had met architects. It was Miralles who was there, and Miralles made long lists for me because I was completely uneducated about architecture. You should read all these books, and I met there Peter Cook and Cedric Price, and then it was with you that we visited when we did the Centre Culturel Suisse project at the beginning of the 90s. It was kind of at the same moment we went together to see Jacques Herzog, and that was another kind of epiphany. You took me to Jacques' studio and Pierre Demeron's studio, and it was kind of first time to see their studio and their kind of collaboration with artists. So that's kind of how it all started.
Mm-hmm. I mean, what hit me now in this Biennale, in Seshima's Biennale, is that there is this wonderful tone of calm and concentration, and it brings out maybe the best in architecture, where it can give you something beyond just walls and beautiful spaces, but on an intellectual way. So I think you are interested very much in these kind of energies. Maybe you tell something about that.
Yeah, I mean, with Sejima, we've worked before. It was when she did Mutations for us, the show we did with Rem Koolhaas and Stefano Boeri and Sanford Quinter. She made an exhibition design of My Invisible City. So it was a show about invisibility, and she came up with this amazing white display, which was really sublime. And that was in Tokyo at TN Probe in 2001. But I think there are all these kinds of ways how from the art world, and I'm obviously rooted in the art world, it's my home base, how we can sort of go into the architecture world. And one is exhibition design not only by architects, but also by artists. I mean, as Richard Hamilton says, great exhibitions always invent a new display feature, and very often it's artists who do that. The other possibility to work with architects is obviously the idea of doing pavilions, something we're doing in London, which Julia Peyton-Johns invented in 2000 with Zaha Hadid, and since I joined in 2006, we're commissioning together these pavilions, and that's kind of so one can produce reality, which is another way of working with architects. And then there is obviously this possibility that architects curate, and suddenly we find ourselves in an environment where an architect sort of curates. And that was the case with Mutations, with Rem, and that's also the case here. I think there are all kinds of possibilities. I mean, it's kind of what is interesting, I think, is that this kind of Schnittstelle, this contact zone between art and architecture, whenever it does happen, it's unbelievably fruitful. I mean, it was very fruitful at the Black Mountain College, when all of a sudden Buckminster Fuller arrived and did a seminar with the students, and there was this connection. It was incredibly effective at the AA. I mean, whenever I speak to Zaha Hadid, she speaks about this magical moment of the AA in the 60s and 70s as a real laboratory, and at the AA you had artists teach, you had architects teach. I mean, Kerith Wynne Evans, who is here in the Architecture Biennale, invited by Sejima, taught also at the AA. So I think whenever we have that contact zone, something great happens.
Mm-hmm. Now I mention a keyword, migrateur. Is that the beginning of your beginning, or one of?
Yes, I mean, the beginning of the work in the institution, the beginning of the beginning was in Switzerland, when I grew up as a child, and I saw lots of exhibitions there. Hang zum Gesamtkunstwerk was a kind of a total inspiration, and I went, I think, 30 times to see this exhibition. I kind of learned it by heart, almost like to know every single exhibit, and then meeting you and Paquette was an epiphany, and then at a certain moment I went to Paris and met Boltanski there, and also met Suzanne Paget. And we sort of she wondered how one could actually practice of curating, which isn't kind of fixed, which is always on the move, how one could bring that into the museum. And the idea of migrateur came out of that, and the idea was somehow, I mean, I also had these cards, there was a title, Migratory Curator, of the museum, and it wasn't a fixed kind of position. It was just to go there, sometimes have an office there, and every now and then an exhibition would pop up. It was also a possibility how a big museum could actually work with artists who maybe are still too young to have a solo show in a museum, and how one could actually bring them in. So it didn't have a space. It was a homeless program. So we didn't have any space attributed, and the program had always to find the space wherever it could find it. So Sarah Say happened to be under the stairways, or Douglas Gordon used the telephone system. He made a graffiti in the toilet, and he also installed one of his text pieces actually in one of the rooms of the museum. Felix González Torres' piece was in an almost Michael Asher kind of way happening in the offices. So Felix came a day, and we went to the market and bought flowers. And he also chose some really wonderful vases, and he put a vase on every person's desk who works in the museum with fresh flowers. And so the idea that maybe it could change the institution, if all of a sudden. So it was very much something where also art could happen where we expected least. Or Ricke Tiravanisha's first museum show happened when he installed a facility to make tea and coffee. So both visitors of the exhibitions and the museum, but also museum staff, could go to a specific place in the museum and make their own tea and make their own coffee. And there was not a single review about Rickrit's show. There was not a single article, and nobody noticed it. But the moment, after a month when it was removed, everybody was really sad. So it only became visible when it wasn't there. So it was really a lot of possibilities, but also to use the museum. And I think that's the great thing about museums being both time storage and laboratory, because somehow I remember when Gabriele Orozco came and we did the Migrateur project with him in the 90s, he was extremely inspired by the basement of the museum, by the hidden vitrines, by the dusty corners, and took lots of photographs. At the end, he only placed very few objects, papier-mâché objects, outside the museum, actually on the parvis. He inserted them in between and presented them then inside. But it was the whole process which was important. Manfred Pernice would be inspired by the Chirico painting, and he suddenly would make a skateboarder ramp and connect it. So lots of things somehow came out of it.